Done.
Perfect. Great. Then while everybody is getting settled in, I would love to welcome all of you to the launch of the Labor Rights Index 2024. My name is Fiona Drastra. I'm the director of the WageIndicator Foundation, and I'll be leading you through the session of today, including moderating our lovely panel that we have with all of you today. We also have a keynote speech from Professor Sean Cooney, whom I hope is now in the room.
Yes.
And oh, perfect. Welcome, Sean. And we also have a presentation from our colleague Iftikhar Ahmad, who is leading the work on the Labor Rights Index, as well as on the labor law database at WageIndicator. He does have some internet issues, so if he cannot join us for the presentation today because of shaky internet, we also have a video of him. So in any case, we're prepared even for internet issues. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat or let us know where you're calling from. Would be great to see different faces from all over the world. As you can see, this is not a webinar style, but more an open meeting, because we would love to also see questions from people and have an open conversation around the panel discussion. And if you have any questions around the Labor Rights Index itself, of course. So please feel free to answer all questions or put all your questions in the chat, and we'll try both in the Q&A session as well as during the meeting to answer all of your questions. Feel free to unmute yourself when you want to ask that question during the Q&A session. But other than that, if Shantanu mutes you, don't feel offended, but we're trying to keep the flow of the meeting going. That being said, we do have a short video for all of you today that we would like to show, just to set the scene a little bit about what the Labor Rights Index is all about. And after that, I would love to give the floor to Professor Sean Cooney from the University of Melbourne, who will lead our keynote address of the day. Shantanu, can you share the video, please?
Sure, just a second. And it should be up on your screen. No.
The Labor Rights Index is a wide-ranging assessment of labor market regulations across the world. The 2024 index builds on the earlier two editions released in 2020 and 2022 by the WageIndicator Foundation. The index evaluates 145 countries on 10 indicators and 46 sub-indicators that influence labor laws and working conditions. These indicators are derived from the Decent Work Agenda of the International Labor Organization. They are grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 5 conventions of the United Nations, 5 declarations, 35 conventions, and 4 recommendations of the International Labor Organization. The Labor Rights Index covers conditions in the most populous province, state, or area in each country, has an actual legal basis for each score, and is built upon applicable labor legislation, focuses on conditions in the formal economy, does not give weights or ranks to different countries, identifies relevant legislative trends, highlights areas for improvement in each country. The index assesses working conditions for workers who meet certain criteria. They are skilled and earn at least the minimum wage. They live in the most populous region of the country and are legally allowed to work there. They are employed full-time through a permanent contract in an enterprise with at least 60 people. They have experience of 1 year and are registered with Social Security institutions for long enough to be entitled to monetary benefits. They are entitled to sick leave, annual leave, maternity and paternity leave, and parental leave. The Labor Rights Index provides a global overview along with a detailed profile for each country. The index can support compliance with labor standards if adopted as a precondition for international trade and investment agreements. Civil society organizations, policymakers, and multilateral organizations can use the index to inform policy debates, from identifying areas of improvement to gaining insights from best practices across the world. Workers and unions can use the findings of the index to negotiate and advocate for better working conditions. The 2024 index shows an improvement in the score of 32 countries due to improvement in legislation. This improvement indicates a clear march to the top, where countries are reforming their legislation in line with the international labor standards. The index also identifies certain global trends, especially in the field of work-life balance, such as various kinds of leave and flexible working arrangements, and in the field of fair treatment, such as equal pay for work of equal value, prohibition of workplace harassment, and equal access to jobs for women. For a detailed look at global progress towards better working conditions, explore the 2024 edition of the Labor Rights Index at laborrightsindex.org.
Thanks a lot, Shantanu. With that, I'm very happy to introduce all of you to our keynote speaker of the day, Professor Sean Cooney, who's a law professor at the University of Melbourne. We're very grateful for you being with us today, Sean, because it's very late in Melbourne at the moment already. So thank you so much for making time to be with us. Can we hear you properly? Can you speak?
Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Great, cool.
Perfect.
Cool.
So just a small introduction to Sean. His research interests are concerned international and comparative labor law and employment law with a specific focus on Asia. Sean has served as a legal specialist in the labor law and reform unit at the ILO in Geneva, where he also provided advice to governments in countries such as China, India, Myanmar, and Pakistan. And we're really grateful to have you with us today, Professor. You have the floor for the keynote address of today.
Oh, thanks so much, Fiona. And I'm really glad. Yes, it's 10 p.m. here, so I'm slightly not entirely fluent. That's because it's the reason why. So yeah, look at I would just like to make a few points and start by thanking Iftihar, who I see is online, for the invitation, and all of you. I want to congratulate you all. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how much work I think goes into a document like this and research like this. But I'll start by sort of mentioning that I've worked with Iftihar and the Centre for Labour Research for the last 2 years in a very important and somewhat difficult project. And I've been really impressed with his diligence and insight and dedication. And it's no surprise that he's able to take a leading role in this, as well as other staff at the centre. And I also want to acknowledge the work of the WageIndicator Foundation in the Netherlands. And I know particularly the work of Kia and Beryl from ILO projects and regulating for decent work and so forth. And super impressed by what they can do. And it's great to be introduced to other collaborators who've worked on the project. So, and thanks to you, Fiona, for coordinating this event and setting me straight with timelines and when and how. And we moved over to summertime over the weekend. Oh, whoops. Can you still see me? Can you still hear me?
Not anymore, but we can hear you well. Yes.
Okay, hold on a second. I think I know what's happened. Sorry.
No worries.
Because I was just getting going. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you properly, but we can't see you.
You can't see me. How about that?
Yes, you're back. Great.
Hey, I didn't even have to call in a technician. Not that I could do that at this time. But anyway, cool, everyone. Sorry about that. Okay, so I was just talking about how so much work that you've done, and I want to start off by talking about that. So I'm going to make really 3 points in my time. I want to talk about the massive amount of work that this sort of exercise requires, How are you going with, by the way, with my Australian accent? Are you coping? I'll try and not make it too
We're loving it.
difficult.
I just got it.
Okay.
I even got a text message from a colleague how much she loves it. So go ahead.
Okay. I love your accent. All right. So I'm going to talk about the amount of work that goes into this, because I think that everyone needs to be aware of that. And then I want to talk a little bit about methods and the uses to which the survey can be put. So I agree that that this index is unique in its ambition and scope, which Fiona, you say in the introduction, and in its comprehensive focus on decent work. And because it is comprehensive and unique, it just must require so many hours by all of you. Now, I've been involved in a number of coding and surveying exercises myself, including the ILX project, the ILO, and LEGOSH and EPLEX. I was recently involved with a review of strike laws around the world in connection with the case before the International Court of Justice. And a number of us in Melbourne from both the law and economics faculties have ourselves produced a small index a few years ago. So all of that leads me to realize how very much work goes into this. So first of all, there's the intellectual work that's required to define the objectives of the index and locating among all the various other indexes that you referred to and ranking projects. And I'll come back to those in a second. Establishing the indicators, working out what the components or the sub-indicators are. And that requires a lot of thought and discussion and, between people with different backgrounds. It's really good that you've got like people from the Netherlands and Pakistan, two very different countries talking about that. Because it means that you can approach these conceptual issues from different angles. So that's just the conceptual issues. And then you have to collect the information. And I think anyone who's tried to go through, say, NatLex, which is the ILO's database of national labour legislation, I mean, it's good, but there's a lot of gaps in it. And particularly where you've got countries that don't have a language like English or French or Spanish, and it can often be hard to get up-to-date information and accurate information. And then you're not only looking for statutes, you're looking sometimes for collective agreements in the Nordic countries, industry award in my own country, judicial decisions, other regulatory material. Problems getting translations and so on. So that collecting, so the conceptual work is difficult, the collecting work is difficult, and then you've got to try and understand the material in its context. You can have two legal provisions that look the same but operate quite differently. We know that from the legal transplants literature, some of you may be familiar with. And then you've got to code it. And that's really a question of judgment. I think your coding is relatively straightforward. Like you haven't tried to do what we did and say sort of 0, 0.5, 0.25, and then get yourself into a mathematical muddle. But even with a simple coding process, you've got to make judgments. So I just reiterate my congratulations to the whole LRI team and my admiration. Let me just make some comments now about the labour, the LRI as a labour rights index as compared to other indices and sort of locate it within the history of these. So I'm not sure how familiar you all are. I mean, my memory definitely goes back into the 1990s when a lot of these things started off. And really, where the first, I think, very famous attempt to give a numerical value to legal provisions was, and this is rather infamous, was by the legal origin scholars in the 1990s. And their approach, which is called a lexametric approach, coded different aspects of legal systems. And it wasn't just labour law, it was corporate law and so forth, to establish correlations with economic performance. And that early work led to really questionable claims about the superiority of common law systems, for example. I'm sure that will irritate many of the Dutch people. And even though that work was quite flawed, it was adopted pretty quickly, the labour aspects in the Doing Business Index that many people will know about. And that work showed, at least early on, little regard for fundamental labour rights. And it was deployed in advocacy roles to promote deregulatory agendas. And so in opposition to the Doing Business, you start to get other indices emerging. And I think the best known might be the Cambridge Legal Regulation Index that Professor Simon Deacon has led for many years. And that's really confronted the Doing Business and using many of the same methods or even better methods and challenge that. So we can kind of locate the decent work basis of the Labour Rights Index in that context. And unlike the Cambridge work, which sort of indirectly deals with decent work, the Labour Rights Index directly addresses decent work, the Sustainable Development Goals, and so on. So I think that's really, you know, a fantastic addition to these other indices that are circulating around. Now, of course, it can't be definitive. And as the video says, you know, some things it doesn't look at is the informal sector, precarious workers, undocumented workers. But that's really, I mean, that's really important work, but it's extremely hard to do. I mean, we had a project with trying to work out what regulates the informal sector in 5 countries, and we had, you know, a big grant to do it, and it was just very, very hard. So I think it's all that means is that, you know, it does what it can. I mean, there are other things that it doesn't cover, but I'm really glad that you're very upfront about that. Just 2 little kind of, I have to say something slightly critical in a keynote address. So but there are only 2 small criticisms. One is that really prompted by saying that Singapore is among the worst countries for workers. And I thought, well, that's kind of true in relation to certain labour rights, but if you take into account health and education and social support and political stability, then if you're a worker in Singapore, you're probably a lot better off than many of the other workers in countries in the Labour Rights Index that have a higher, are in a higher category. So maybe that's just a question of being a little bit more careful with the language. I don't know. That's just a comment. You can take it or leave it. The second, and Iftihar will know completely why I say this, because I'm a bit obsessed with OSH, and I thought of all the different indicators. They're really well designed, but I reckon if it's possible, you could adjust or tweak the OSH components a little bit, just because I think things like PPE and training, they're important, but they're not as fundamental in terms of the conventions or in terms of good OSH practice compared to creating a culture of prevention through specific duties, the right to live a dangerous workplace, and effective workplace collaboration. So anyway, that's just a suggestion of something that you could look at in future Labour Rights Index, but I hasten to add they're very, very minor points. Just lastly, to talk a little bit about the use that can be made of the index. So one of the, I think there's perhaps 3 different potential or at least 3 potential uses to talk about. So one is research, and there I think it's a very useful tool to try and get a comprehensive glance around the world at once. You know, I've got it kind of, I'll have it at my side over the next year. Interesting to see whether you could use it to make correlations with other sorts of phenomena like economic growth or political systems. That's what the early legal origins scholars sought to do, but and Simon Deacon's done that kind of work, but you know, it's very tricky. And I think you have to be an expert in econometrics to even attempt it. But there are interesting questions around, well, how does your position in the Labour Rights Index compare to, you know, your political system, particularly given the unfortunate increase in authoritarian systems that we're seeing. Anyway, I'll leave that for other researchers, but a great input potentially to interdisciplinary research. The second thing is advocacy and using it in like the sort of work that Iftihar and I have been doing when you're talking with governments about, well, this is what other countries are doing. How about you think about this as well? I think it's really good seeing the developments in gender equality, and that the index is really useful on those issues in particular, not just those issues, but that stood out to me. And then lastly, there was a discussion of trade agreements. I'm a little bit more cautious about that because just trade agreements are often located in a big power differential, especially when they involve the United States or the European Union. Of course, I understand why for domestic political purposes, it's really important for the US and the EU to insist on compliance with labour rights, but it often seems to just work one way. Like it's not like countries in the global south can conduct labour reviews very easily of the United States or insist that the United States comply with conventions or ratify conventions. I'm just put that in as because I know many of you on the call are probably from the global south, and the use of trade agreements I think should be approached with quite a degree of caution. Anyway, I'll stop there, but I just want to reiterate one more time what a fantastic achievement this is, and to congratulate everyone who's been involved with it. And I hope this continues many years, although that people need to be sure that they work reasonable hours and take leave in between doing work. Okay.
Thank you so much, Sean. Highly agree with you on the amount of work, but also thanks a lot for giving us some pointers on how we could tweak some of the next editions, of course, because we will continue with the Labour Rights Index also in 2026 and 2028 and all years afterwards. So for sure, and the team needs to sleep in between, of course. Thank you so much, Sean. When we have the Q&A in the panel, there might be some questions for you still as well. So I appreciate you staying on for so late still. That being said, I would love to now introduce to all of you, if you don't know him yet, Iftikhar Ahmad, who's our labor law lead at WageIndicator, but also the director of the Center for Labor Research in Pakistan. Iftikhar, do you feel like you have good enough internet connection to do your presentation like this?
I can do, but we can also send the video just to make sure that.
Okay, we'll do the video and then we can do the Q&A with you live afterwards.
Yeah.
Does that work? Okay. Then Shantanu, can you start the video? Thanks a lot. So Iftikhar is not only part of the Center for Labor Research and the WageIndicator Foundation, but he has been leading the work within WageIndicator, both on our labor law database as well as on the Labor Rights Index for the past, I think, 15 years, more or less. He works closely together with numbers of universities and leading experts on international labor law. He also co-authored the Islamic Labor Code, which is based on the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, but also international labor law, of course. I'm very happy that he's here with us. We do have a video to make sure that at least the explanation of the Labor Rights Index is going well. Afterwards, we'll have a Q&A so everybody can ask questions to Iftikhar and the team, because his team from Center for Labor Research is also here. So feel free to put any of your questions in the chat while the video is playing, and then we get to that after the presentation. Shantanu?
Ahmed, I'm the Global Lead Labor Law at the WageIndicator Foundation, and I'm also the founder of Center for Labor Research. The Center for Labor Research is a non-profit organization based in Pakistan. We work on comparative labor issues, as well as we work with the federal and provincial governments on labor law reform. The center is also the Global Labor Law Office of the WageIndicator Foundation. It's a humbling moment for me to present before you the third edition of the Labor Rights Index. We started this journey 4 years ago, with the first version launching in 2020, and it had 115 countries. In 2022, we launched the second version, in which we included 135 countries, and this is the third edition, including 145 countries. We plan to expand it further, but at this moment, let's talk about what it entails. Labor law is the only legal field encompassing the full spectrum of life, from birth, in the sense that the parents have access to certain kinds of leave, to childhood, where the legislation prohibits the employment of children, and youth, where a person starts working in the labor market and the labor legislation regulates their working and employment conditions, and to demise, where the legislation provides for funeral grants and survivors' benefits, or the compensation to the worker and the families. Goal 8 under the Sustainable Development Goals refers to full and productive employment and decent work for all. However, decent work for all cannot be achieved unless the enactment of legislation is in line with the international labor standards and workers know about their rights. Similarly, Goal 16 refers to strong and inclusive institutions as well as the rule of law. The Labor Rights Index aims at an active contribution towards the Sustainable Development Goals by providing complementary insights into de jure provisions on the issues covered, in particular by Goal 5, gender equality, Goal 8, decent jobs, Goal 10, reduced inequalities, and Goal 16, strong institutions. The Labor Rights Index scores countries based on applicable labor laws only. It does not comment on actual working conditions or labor law compliance in workplaces. The Labor Rights Index scores 145 economies on 10 areas of labor market regulation. As you can see before you on screen, these are referred to as indicators. These are further divided into 46 subtopics or sub-indicators. So what is unique about the Labor Rights Index? The Labor Rights Index is based on the principles set down in international labor standards and various UN conventions and covenants. What we are measuring countries against are not some gold-plated or utopian standards. These represent the basic minimum conditions of work that every worker should get, and that the world has already agreed upon by adopting these international instruments by the ILO or UN. These are the basic labor protections or fundamental labor guarantees that everyone should have access to, and they should receive it. So the Labor Rights Index and its scoring methodology is based on 5 UN conventions and covenants, 5 ILO declarations, 35 ILO conventions, 9 ILO recommendations, and 1 ILC resolution. We take into account the basic provisions of these conventions and recommendations to create the scoring methodology. The index evaluates countries along 10 indicators: fair wages, decent working hours, employment security, family responsibilities, maternity at work, safe work, social security, fair treatment, child and forced labor, and freedom of association. These indicators, 10 indicators, and 46 sub-indicators are derived from ILO's decent work agenda. Based on the country scores, which range between 0 to 100, a 6-point scale ranging from total lack of decent work to access to decent work is created. Our work also indicates that out of 135 countries covered in 2022, 25 countries have improved their ratings during the last 2 years due to reforms, while the ratings have decreased for 4 countries. These have been colored in purple. The key updates for this 2024 are that we have included 10 new countries, thus raising the number to 135. The country profiles include more contextual indicators to help receive the scores of a country in a much better way. For example, we are including the data from the World Bank and the ILO, as well as the WageIndicator Foundations on minimum wages and living wages databases on the minimum wages and living wages, labor force, non-formal economy, social production coverage, trade union density, collective bargaining coverage, female labor force participation rate, so that you can look at a country's score from the Labor Rights Index and then see how much of that score is relevant considering the situation in that country. It gives complete legal basis for each component score. adding to the transparency on how each country was scored and rated, you'll find the complete legal basis for each country in its country profiles, not only in the PDF, but also online. It shares relevant legislative trends since 2022. There has been a reform, or if the local law has remained the same. This was the background. I would like to focus now on the key takeaways that we can show you by our work on the Labor Rights Index. The first key takeaway is that the presence of regulatory frameworks alone is not enough. The mere existence of regulatory frameworks is not enough. The newly released Be Ready report by the World Bank clearly shows that there is a considerable gap between the de jure labor law in the form of regulatory frameworks and the provision of public services by state institutions. And we can see the same thing from our work on the Labor Rights Index. However, the important question is whether these regulatory frameworks are compliant with the international labor standards that are available in the form of ILO conventions and recommendations. What the Labor Rights Index does is that it measures the quality of existing labor legislation or regulatory framework in 145 economies on those international standards. Just to give you an example, for the Labor Rights Index, the mere existence of annual leave is not enough. The countries are scored positively only if there is a provision for at least 3 working weeks of annual leave. Our work indicates that while 143 countries, after 145 countries covered in the Labor Rights Index, provide for annual leave in their legislation, only 70%, 101 countries, require at least 3 working weeks of annual leave for a worker on completion of 12 months of service. The standard is derived from the ILO Convention 132, and this is a contribution of the Labor Rights Index, that it is measuring local labor legislation against the international standards. The second key takeaway is that the abundance of labor legislation in a country does not mean that the labor rights are protected and guaranteed. There's a common argument that countries already have enough legislation and should put effort into implementing it. That's not necessarily the case. I'll give you an example from Pakistan. Pakistan has more than 40 pieces of labor legislation regulating the labor market. The labor legislation is mainly sector-specific, incoherent, inconsistent, and ambiguous, and is not in line with the international labor standards. By retaining this outdated and incoherent legislation, the country is failing its 80 million strong labor force and 240 million people. Just to show you an example, this is all the legislation that the country has for regulating labor market in the country. And since the legislation in Pakistan is also exists only at the provincial level, which means that in each province, there are 4 provinces. So in each province, there are nearly 40 pieces of legislation that the companies have to comply with, the employers have to know about. Key takeaway is that countries don't have to be rich to protect workers' rights. While there is a considerable gap of 20 points between the average scores of low income, the average score is 65, and high income countries, average score is 84, there is a ray of hope indicating that change is possible and is happening right before our eyes. Our country does not have to be a high income country to protect workers' rights within its borders. We have trailblazers from low income and lower middle income countries who have relatively high scores on the labor rights index. They could be trendsetters within their respective regions. From the low-income countries, we have the example of Mozambique. It has a high score of 76. And then we have, from the lower middle-income countries, we have the example of Cote d'Ivoire. It has a score of 84.5. From the low-income and lower middle-income countries, we have the examples mainly from Africa, which is a good case to show, and also from Central Asia. But the key takeaway is that a country does not have to be rich to take care of its workers, to give them the rights that their constitutions are asking for, and that the world has already talked about in the form of international conventions and recommendations. One more point that I would like to mention here, that if you look at the scores for these countries on SDG indicator 8.8.2, which measures the level of national compliance with labor rights in actual and the rights of freedom of association and collective bargaining, these countries also have reasonable scores because the score on SDG indicator ranges between 0 to 10, where 0 being the best possible score and 10 being the worst score, except in the case of Uzbekistan, which has a higher score on SDG indicator 8.8.2. An important key takeaway is that we wanted to focus on the regions which are either low scoring or high scoring. If you look at these 11 regions, the lowest scoring region is South Asia. It has an average score of 57, while the highest scoring region is Western Europe. There is a gap of 35 points. And the point that I would like to make is that South Asia is seemingly the only region that is lagging behind, with 6 countries covered under the index and a population of 1.91 billion people, 780 million labor force. This is a cause of concern. However, given the current reform efforts in all South Asian countries, especially in India, where we already have 4 new labor codes since 2020, although they have yet to become effective, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka are already working on reforming their labor legislation with complete drafts ready in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. We are hopeful that the situation will change and hopefully the de jure and de facto state of labor rights will improve in this region as well. An important question is what aspects of labor law are changing and where are the reforms happening. So just to show you, the aspects of labor law that are changing are, for example, the decent working hours, employment security where the length of external contracts is being limited. The paternity leave is now we see more and more countries regulating it. The flexible working arrangements for parents, paid nursing breaks. Maternity leave is also being raised in many countries. The important reform is the prohibition of pregnancy inquiry, asking about a worker's pregnancy during the hiring procedures, during the hiring process. This is an important reform that is happening in countries. Then we can see reforms around fair treatment, prohibition of sexual harassment and fraud, equal access to same jobs as men, equal remuneration for work of equal value, and reforms around social security and freedom of association. And yes, there are 20 countries which revised their minimum wage during the last 2 years. These were the countries which did not revise their wages between the period from 2020 to 2022, and they had a negative score. But from 2022 to 2024, since they have revised their wages, hence their score became 1. The countries where reforms are happening are these countries: Nigeria, Angola, Australia, also had the reform, Bangladesh, Chile, Congo, DRC. So these are all the countries. You can find all these details in the report. The important takeaway is that 31 countries, 71 reforms scattered around 32 sub-indicators. This is the important takeaway that we need to remember. The last takeaway that I would like you to see is that there is room for reform across all 10 indicators. But the indicators where reform is badly needed is the freedom of association, family responsibilities, employment security. I would also like you to take this chart with caution, because although the chart is showing that SafeWork has a little room for reform, but we are covering under the index at a very limited part of the occupational safety and health. What we are covering is that whether the employer provides free personal protective equipment to the worker, are there employment injury benefits, whether employer provides training on occupational safety and health to workers, and whether the pregnant and nursing women are prohibited from work that can be hazardous to their health or of their children. So these need to be considered while looking at our methodology and the aspects of labor law that we are covering, but still, the important thing is that it indicates already that there is room for reform across all indicators. The numbers that we are quoting under this index are not merely statistics. Rather, these should be taken as a call to action and a rallying cry for reforms. To improve the situation on the ground, countries must first enact legislation that is clear, unambiguous, coherent, and consistent with the international labor standards. And then most important is that it is without any loopholes, because sustainable development goals cannot be achieved with a legislation which is ambiguous and which is incoherent and inconsistent with the international. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation of the Labor Rights Index. But before I go, I would like to thank my team at the Center for Labor Research, who have done a great work during the last 7-8 months in producing this third version of the Labor Rights Index. I'm also thankful to the Wage Indicator and the country teams who have supported our work in producing the third version of the Labor Rights Index. Most important of all, I would like to thank my family for their support. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone.
Perfect. Now I'm hoping that the real life version of Iftikhar is there with sufficient internet connection. Iftikhar, feel free to keep your video off if that's helpful for the internet connection. I do would like to, and thanks to everybody for sharing your questions and your discussion points in the chat. I think they're extremely relevant and important to discuss with the launch of this index. First, I would like to go to the first question that was asked by Abid Niaz Khan about, and maybe Abid, maybe you would like to share the question yourself if your internet connection allows it. But otherwise I can read it as well. So Abid shares with us, he says, colleagues, as we celebrate the World Decent Work Day, the Labor Rights Index coherence across diverse country scenarios might be given a consideration, noting that unrest, conflicts, wars, and authoritarianism is marring many countries. Laws might still be there, but rights might not. What do you think? Iftikhar, can you maybe share some reflections on that?
No, yes, it's true that the legislation might not be implemented. But the first thing that shows the commitment of a government, even the governments that we don't like, is that they are committed to the welfare of their people because they have enacted a legislation. The second step, yes, always, it's always good to know how much of that legislation is being implemented. But as I said during the presentation, the most important thing is where the legislation is compliant with the international standards. And that's the first step that we want to talk about in this index.
Fiona, you're on mute right now.
Oops, thank you so much. Thanks, Iftikhar. So somebody has their mic open, which I'm gonna mute first.
Yeah, muted them, muted them.
Perfect. Then there were a couple of comments, Iftikhar, also on some of the current discussions that are going on in some provinces in Pakistan. I know you've been part of some of these discussions in Pakistan as well. Could you maybe reflect on the question that was asked by Waqas as well as by Dominic on some of the new laws that are being presented in Sindh and Punjab in Pakistan specifically, and what the role of the trade unions there is in changing some of the laws?
The response that I would like to give, because I was part of that exercise, is that it's the job of the government to enact legislation. The legislation, in essence, is the responsibility of government. And yes, it has to enact legislation in consultation with social partners. So I'm sure the provincial governments, both in Punjab and Sindh, are consulting their social partners effectively, and they will enact the legislation that is acceptable to all.
Thanks a lot, Iftikhar. Then there's another question from Gashal, where he says that he agrees with you that mere development of laws may or may not help to secure labor rights, and that government commitment must also be taken into consideration. Then he says, having said that, do you think what can be done to increase end users' pressures to comply or check whether labor rights are, what can be done to increase the pressure on end users on whether labor rights are being respected, yes or no? Such as, for example, what we've seen in Ethiopia and the work that we do together is how we see, and it is believed that in the flower industry, so a specific sector in Ethiopia, there's better compliance with labor laws than, for example, in the textile sector in the same country. What's your reflection on that?
Well, I think, yes, it's quite relevant in the sense that end user or the consumer or the countries where the developing countries are sending their goods. It's depend a lot on them, be it US or the European Union, if they require either part of the trade agreements or GSP plus schemes or GSP schemes, it is always helpful because the legislation does exist at times, although the work that we are doing under the Labor Rights Index is clearly showing that, yes, abundance of labor legislation not at all means that they are coherent. Pakistan has more than 40 pieces of legislation, and it has a score of 53.5, which is a good indicator that legislation alone is not enough. It is incoherent legislation. So yes, engaging the end users is really helpful.
Great. There was also another question from Waqas about the Apprenticeship Act, specifically, I assume, in Pakistan. He mentions that we are far behind. I assume the Pakistanis are far behind with the Apprenticeship Act. Can you maybe share a small reflection on that?
Well, I mean, I do know about the act, although, I mean, we did not consider it as part of the Labor Rights Index. We don't look at it. But Apprenticeship Act, yes, although the governments are reforming the Apprenticeship Act now because most of the jobs are in the services sector, and the services sector earlier was not covered under that law. So, and yes, the law as we have now, it requires companies to hire a certain number of workers in a factory or workplace so that they can be trained. But the first question, as I always say, is to have a law which is without loopholes, which is coherent and consistent. The second step is always, yes, to ensure compliance. And even if the governments are lagging behind in compliance, people, once they know about their rights, they can always go to the courts. They can always ensure through their unions to ensure that they get their rights, what the law is asking them to have.
Great, thanks a lot. For the sake of time, I would love to move on to our panel discussion, but I would like to ask you, Iftikhar, to stay with us also for the panel discussion so we can keep it as part of the conversation. Also noting Mohammed's question about Professor Cooney and Iftikhar's experience in the consolidation of labor laws in Punjab. Perhaps we can get back to that question during the panel discussion. But I would very much love to introduce our amazing panel with all of you today, with whom we'll have a broader discussion about the use of the Labor Rights Index, as well as in the context of the world that we are in today. Without further ado, I would like to introduce all of you to Anne Trebilcock, who is affiliated to the Institute of Labor Law at the University of Göttingen in Germany. She's a former official of the ILO, as well, serving as a legal advisor after working on fundamental principles and rights at work, policy integration, and labor law reform. She has authored and edited several books, chapters, and articles, and most recently the book on social justice and the world of work, possible global features. And welcome to the session. Then we also have with us today Elena Sichenko, who's an associate professor of Russian and international labor law, now teaching at the University of St. Petersburg University and the University of Bologna. Great to see you again, Elena. She received her PhD degree from the University of Catania in 2016, and has a master's degree with honors from the St. Petersburg State University, and is also a Fulbright scholar at Wharton Business School. In 2019, she received the prestigious Jean Monnet module to teach European labor law, and she has consulted multiple times with the ILO as well. Welcome, Elena. With us, we also have Grace Camara, who's a senior legal advisor and garment and apparel sector lead for global rights compliance, and which is an international human rights law and development firm. Grace manages multi-stakeholder initiatives that strengthen the regulatory environment and facilitate access to remedy for human and labor rights violations. Grace has over 15 years of experience advising on corporate accountability initiatives, both for private sector and not-for-profit organizations. And as a trustee and board member of the Circle, she also advises on EU policy developments for the organization's campaign for living wages for garment workers. Welcome, Grace, and thanks for being with us last minute. Last but not least, we have Ken Chamuvashawa, who's a senior economist and head of the Regional Economic and Social Analysis Unit at the ILO Asia Pacific office based in Bangkok. And he's a member of ILO's research department. His interests are specifically on economics of labor markets, health and labor, and the growth finance environmental nexus. He also focuses on trade and agricultural policy. And prior to joining the ILO, he was a policy economist at the Common Market for Eastern and Southern African and trade economist at the African Union, coming from Malawi, but calling in from Bangkok, right, Ken? Welcome to the team and to the panel. Shamsun, can you also highlight Iftikhar? Because I would also love to have Iftikhar as being part of this panel. This great group of experts are sharing with us their reflections from their perspective and their experience in their world of work on how on the use of the Labor Rights Index. And can I start with you and ask you if you could share some reflections from your perspective with us?
Thank you very much. And thanks very much to the organizers of this for the invitation. To comment on what is really very exciting work. And it is a lot of work, as Sean Cooney pointed out. There is skepticism in the legal community around indicators. Most prominently, Alain Suppiot in his book, Governance by Numbers, where he explores from ruling by law to governing by numbers. Nevertheless, they are there, they are happening. There is increased reliance on them, and I think it's all the more important to work towards improving what is out there in terms of tools that can be used to inform better government policy and greater respect for workers' rights in this world. My comments basically relate to three aspects of the index. One is context, another is structure, and finally a comment on some sources. The video presentation explained what you are taking into account quite well. That was not obvious from a quick look at the index itself. So I would suggest that there be more context given, perhaps with links to other sources. For example, basic facts about the economic activity of a country, which sectors are the most important, what percent of the workforce is involved in formal employment, as traditionally explained. And here, the International Conference of Labor Statisticians of the ILO has recently done some important work on how you can try to measure that. It is difficult, but there are techniques that can be used. And I think that would help situate the index to indicate what percent of the population are we really talking about here. Similarly, what is the percentage of women participating in the labor market compared to men? Just some basic facts like that, I think would help. There could also be links to some of the other sources, and I'll get back to that in a moment. In terms of the structure, it's very good that it covers more than fundamental principles and rights at work, because obviously work is a multidimensional experience. But I wonder, why was there a redefinition, basically, of some of the fundamental principles and rights at work? Or rather, perhaps a lack of total articulation between what is in the index and what is encompassed by those rights. For example, why is it called fair treatment and not elimination of discrimination? I think the lumping together of child labor and forced labor is particularly problematic. They have different reasons behind them. They have different trajectories and they have different remedies. And it's a bit, I understand it's important to maintain a structure that is simple, that is manageable. But I would really urge taking a fresh look at that and asking more questions about those things. One of the complications, I think, of the exclusion that the index has made to exclude people who are not legally in a country has a particular repercussion when it comes to forced labor and the exploitation of undocumented workers in a whole system of abuse. And that is going to be missed in the index because of this putting them together. So it's perhaps a bit of a too blunt instrument when it comes to child labor and forced labor. I would also echo what Sean Pooney said about some of the criteria that is used for the indicators for occupational safety and health. The worker's right to refuse unsafe work is critical. The use of engineering controls as a first option to try to eliminate risks is as important as personal protective equipment. If those engineering controls are in place, you don't need as much personal protective equipment. There's also, when I looked at a country profile, I took Germany because that's where I live. It seemed that one of the fundamental conventions now has not been picked up by the index, and that is since the 2022 revision of the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, Convention 187 on occupational safety and health management systems is considered a fundamental convention, and it should be taken into account when you look at what countries have ratified or not ratified. And there will be increasing ratifications of that because, of course, one of the purposes of the ILO Declaration was to encourage ratification of the conventions that are considered critical. In terms of sources, I mentioned some earlier, and I think it would, I'm not sure how feasible it would be, but to somehow have cross-references to other indexes that exist. For example, the work that the ILO has done along with the Center for Global Worker Rights at the University of Pennsylvania goes into much more depth in relation to Sustainable Development Goal Indicator 8.8.2. They measure, it's not measuring the same thing, it's measuring an increase in the compliance with freedom of association, collective bargaining, labor rights. But it is the questions that it asks, I think, are quite good and were developed with participation of ILO experts in the field, such as Karen Curtis from the Freedom of Association branch. So again, I don't know how feasible that is to do, but that certainly deserves a closer look because of the absolutely fundamental nature, as Iftikhar pointed out, of freedom of association and collective bargaining. In relation to federal countries, I found it interesting that you take the biggest state. That may work for some countries. I'm not sure it works for the United States because California is probably more progressive in its legislation than some other also equally big states like Texas or Florida would be. Maybe something to toy with would be also taking a state or a couple of states that have been innovators. For example, there are a couple of states in the United States that have increased the protection for domestic workers. So to take kind of a lighthouse state, or perhaps in Australia, there's an example as well that could be used. Federal states, I think, pose a complication because they can vary in terms of which level is responsible for what, and it becomes very difficult to track. But at least to acknowledge that and to indicate that the information is going to be give a partial picture and can't possibly be compared to a state where you have a much more unitary system. I think that's, yes, and one other comment about forced labor, which I forgot to mention. There's no reference in the list to the protocol to the Forced Labor Convention, which was adopted in 2014. And I think that's quite important because it also links to more robust ways to prevent forced labor and to remedy it when it has been found. So I think with those comments, I would just like to encourage you to continue what is extremely difficult work. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anne. Great points, and I'm sure that the team has already thought about it and or will pick it up for the next edition for sure. We're always happy to receive feedback like this also throughout the year to improve the index where we can. Elena, can I move to you and ask you some of your reflections on the Labor Rights Index?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really an honor to be in team with such acknowledged experts, particularly as Anne, Kenshawa, Grace. And I would like to start with praising because I think it's really an awesome product and it might be used by for very different purposes. So I, as a person teaching international labor law and comparative law, I'm proposing this product for the students to better understand the impact of international labor law in different countries. And also it is a very well done instrument which make you easily understand the differences. For sure, there are limitations, but it is impossible to do such enormous work without these limitations. But I will come back to the limitations a little bit afterwards. And also, I wanted to underline that you have improved significantly from the previous version of the index. And I think that you have responded to some of the criticism which we labor lawyers expressed in respect of your work. And it's great that you, for example, you have added the additional indicators in the very top, making us understand the background of each country. I think it's really valuable because it provides you with a more reliable picture of how the things are going in a particular state. Also, it's great that you give us a possibility to tackle the trend. So if the things are improving, if the legislation is improving, or it's or the efficiency or the legislation is decreasing. The coverage of states and the coverage of topics is an absolute success, because I think there are no other products which provide the basic information about the labor law regulations in so many different countries. Having said that, I also think that your index might be used not only for the teaching purposes and research purposes as a first step towards the analysis of national labor laws, but I think it also might be used in the processes of due diligence, in the processes of corporate sustainability reporting. So all these information might be helpful for the companies which will follow the new EU directives on reporting and due diligence. Again, as a first step, because, for example, if everyone has to guarantee, I mean, every country has to guarantee the human rights at work. And if the right to strike is under question in the ILO system, it is not under question in the system of the UN human rights bodies, as it is directly acknowledged in the UN Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So basically, this is why it is very important that you have a very clear database on the freedom of association, and you underline that if the right to strike is guaranteed, and provide different indicators, additional indicators in this respect. And also, I was thinking about the ways which might improve the perception of the information you have gathered around the world. And I think perhaps, I understand that you can speak only about legislation, that it is incredibly difficult to speak about law in action. However, perhaps it would be practical and it would be helpful for the users to add the link to the different databases which measure the rule of law in the country. So to make people understand if these laws are really implemented, as the World Bank database, a couple of UN database, and some others. Also, when I was considering the information on fair wages, and again, trying to attach these sources of information with the sources of information which might be needed for reporting and following the due diligence, perhaps you should think about introducing the indicator on living wage. And also, as a wage indicator, you have a lot of information on in this respect. And another point is discrimination. So you have just few indicators on discrimination, and what I'm particularly mindful for is the lack of indicator about the burden of proof. Because in many countries, if you don't enact, if there are no norms on the shift of the burden of proof in discrimination cases, it would mean that no judicial protection from discrimination indeed exists. And the very last point, I think that it would be also interesting to provide some more information in cases when no data exists. So perhaps provide links to the ILO comments of the Committee of Freedom of Association, or the Committee of Experts, as, for example, in case of the Arab states when they have no legislation covering freedom of association and strikes. But these are some small spots which you might consider in enhancing your work. But overall, I'm really absolutely impressed by your work, and I think no one else in the world might do it, only Iftikhar Ahmad with his perfect team. And I can imagine how many days and nights he spent over this work. So I'm really impressed, and I really admire you guys. Very good work, and thank you so much for it.
Thanks a million, Elena. And Grace, could you share with us a little bit about how you see the use of the Labor Rights Index also being useful in your field? where you also work extensively on upcoming EU legislation.
Absolutely. Thank you for the introduction, Fiona. And I'm really delighted to be here and to share my insights on the index, which I think is fabulous and is going to be a crucial and essential tool for, I think, most stakeholders. As you mentioned earlier, I work mainly in the garment sector, so I advise international brands on EU legislation and particularly the up and coming due diligence rules that we're seeing. And so this piece of work is going to be very important for global rights compliance and the work we do in that space. Just to reflect on Elena's point very quickly, I agree. I mean, we do a lot of work on living wages, and it would be good to see more information on that, because obviously that is becoming a key point of focus for international brands, but also across other sectors as well. The launch of the index for us is particularly timely, because for many brands, for them to really meaningfully participate in discussions around living wages and other issues, they need data. And what we found is there's really a dearth of data across the board, but particularly in respect of wages. So, for example, the fair wages component of the index, which tells you whether local laws stipulate minimum wages or whether these are determined through collective bargaining, is really very helpful for garment brands, as they need to understand the risk profile of doing business in particular garment countries, particularly the traditional garment producing countries, where we do see a lot of labor rights issues. So to be able to add something on living wages would make it a more comprehensive and holistic tool. So that's maybe just the first point, but obviously it's, as a starting point, it's a fantastic tool for those companies. And of course, as we're seeing, as you mentioned, the EU legislation, we're seeing we have in the garment sector the EU textile strategy. So it's becoming more, the need for data is becoming more pertinent for companies, as the industry generally in the fashion sector is becoming more regulated. So being able to access this data, and also for it to be credible data, is incredibly important. Again, with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, we're in the middle of a transposition process. So of course, it will help to inform those companies as well, and for other stakeholders that are engaging in those processes. And I think in terms of living wages, really put that at front and center, or fair wages in general, really put that discussion at front and center. And for us all to be able to have a reference point to say, well, these are the trends that we're seeing, these are the gaps that we're also seeing, and this is something that we can either use this as a basis to strengthen the legislation that's coming through, so that there's more accountability from corporates and also from suppliers to address these issues, or at least foster debate and discussion around how to tackle these issues. So for us, it's an indispensable tool that will, I think, inform the wage setting process that's been recommended by the ILO with regard to living wages and methodologies, but also more generally, I think, foster social dialogue that we're seeing, that we need to have with regard to living wages, particularly because obviously it's a very complex subject. Just a couple of points, and I think it's really just to pick up on what has been said previously about areas where perhaps areas of future focus in the garment sector specifically. And I think it's helpful to give a bit more context with regard to, and be a bit more sector specific, and just to give reflections on what we're seeing in terms of feedback from business, etc. So we know that, for example, migrant workers are a huge factor in garment production and supply in different regions around the world, particularly in Turkey and other places like that. And they do play a significant role in the enforcement of or lack of labor rights, and particularly around wages and working conditions, etc. So I think it would be helpful to see. I know it's probably very difficult information to collect and get hold of, but I think for us to have a full picture of what's happening, particularly in the garment sector, with regards to workers' rights, I think there needs to be some focus on migrant workers. And similarly, and sort of direct this a little bit, Iftikhar, in Pakistan, we run a huge program in Pakistan looking at labor rights in the garment sector, in the ready-made garment sector. And we know that, at least anecdotally, that that there are workers, again, temporary workers, workers that have traveled from other states and regions, who maybe are not as stable, so they, kind of have a migrant status in a way, who are again more vulnerable, from more vulnerable communities. But again, a lot of that is anecdotal, and we're not necessarily collecting that data. So I think it would be helpful to have that focus. Also in Pakistan as well, we know, and again, it's again with other garment producing countries, the prevalence of home workers as well, who are kind of often left to their own devices in terms of having to fight for their labor rights and enforce their labor rights, and don't often get the support that the factory workers do through the various trade unions or worker participation committees. So again, this is, I think, an area that we would be helpful to focus on, just again to give the brand and other stakeholders a more holistic picture of what is happening with regard to labor rights. But of course, I would say overall, it's a fantastic tool, and it's definitely something that will be integral for our work going forward. So thank you.
Thanks a million, Grace. Ken, can I ask you, last but definitely not least, to share your reflections? And then after Ken's reflections, I propose we move on to the next session, and then I'll have Iftikhar do a closing reflection on all of your amazing feedback, because it's really much appreciated. Ken, go ahead.
So thanks very much. Some few weeks ago, I was in Pakistan, and I had a chance to meet Mr. Istar Ahmed. We had dinner, and he was able to explain to me a lot of many things about this index. And I think that's the way I also made it to this important meeting today. So I want to congratulate you for this great work, the Center for Labor Research, but also the Wage Index. This is really a lot of work. As Professor Sean mentioned in the beginning, it is not easy to really have all these bits and parts together and try to put a figure to this. I mean, it's enormous work, and I really would like to appreciate that you are able to do that. And I know you do that with a lot of pleasure, judging from what I got when I talked to you. I probably am the only economist here. The rest have looked to me like they are very astute lawyers, and they are able to express themselves very well in terms of labor rights, in terms of the laws. And when I looked at the index very quickly, I was already looking at how does this really relate to issues economics. But before I say that, I must accept that I found it very useful that you are able to use a lot of these databases that ILO produces, the NAT lakes, the NOM lakes, the EP lakes, the IR lakes. I think it's important because when you use these databases and give us feedback, then we're also able to see, how we can actually improve these databases, but also to make sure that there is that interrelationship with what other organizations are doing. And I think I really want to like that so much. I also want to say that the ILO is very much evidence-based and promotes kind of evidence-based interventions. And the center that I lead, the Regional Economic and Social Analysis Unit here, is really the hub of looking at evidence for Asia and Pacific, and using that evidence to support our countries, to support our region. And therefore, I find this index, this initiative, a very, very important one, because it does give us the chance to look at the evidence and then use it to see how we can promote important issues, social justice, important issues, decent work. So I find it really important that I say some few things about the index in relation to the labor markets. The first point that I would like to mention is that when I look at assumptions of this index, and assumptions are key to every economist, they help you to make your conclusions. I see very clearly that we're looking at people who are skilled, we're looking at the formal market, formal employment, we're looking for enterprises that have employees who are more than 60. that's important. But very quickly, I went back to my data to look at Asia Pacific and also the other countries, including Africa. And I realized that, of course, our emphasis on the formal employment, our emphasis on the formal structures, then do not give us chance to look at the reality that exists in most of these countries. And what is the reality? Most of these countries actually are informal. Informal employment in Asia, for example, has 1.3 billion people, highest in the world. In terms of absolute numbers, proportionally, Africa would have 85%. Asia has about 66%. But when you look at the absolute numbers, Asia Pacific will have 1.3 billion people in informal employment. Now, the index will not be talking about them, all right? Because we're saying that we are dealing with the skilled, we're dealing with formal employment. So that was one thing that I wondered, how would we ensure that, maybe the index is inclusive? I'm really talking from the point of view of having to see the relationship between the index and what's happening in the labor markets. And I think Sean talked about it when he talked about the correlations that would need some econometric work and things like those. The second one that I wanted to mention, again, is what I was reflecting upon. When I look at some of the results in terms of the indicators, I'll use an example of child labor, child and forced labor. I see that in terms of the indices, in terms of the laws, in terms of the legislation that you have assessed, it actually has a very good value. I think it's about 80, 90, all right? Now, I very quickly then looked at what is the level of child labor in Asia and Pacific. And I discovered that 49 million children are in child labor. Now, again, it is an issue of how do we interpret this index in terms of what is really happening in the labor markets. On the ground, we are saying, let's fight this vice because big numbers of children are actually stuck in this. And when we get to the index, it says, well, the laws are there, the legislation is there, these countries have done it. How do we ensure that our interpretation does not then say, well, we have done enough here, but how do we then relate it to what's happening on the ground and say, although this is the case, in terms of what is really happening in terms of labor markets, the story is a little bit different, and that we need action in those areas together. Again, it also came to me to say, okay, fine. I mean, so if you look at the index, how does that then translate into issues that we're facing here in the region? We have declining labor force participation rates. This is a region where 73 million workers are in extreme poverty. This is a region where only 41%, less than 50% of the population, can access at least one social benefit of social security. How do these statistics relate with this index? Because when I look at the index, I see somewhere where things are okay. And then very quickly, I go to the data in terms of labor markets, in terms of the economics of it, and I see, kind of a different story. Now, I was suggesting that there will be need to really knit this together. I think to really emphasize the fact that we are really just looking at legislations that exist. And I think we're not really looking at the implementation as such. So countries may have, tick the box in terms of them having legislation on minimum wages, having legislation on social protection, having legislation on all these things. But maybe those legislation do not really translate into anything meaningful into some of the countries in terms of implementation. So I think that needs to come out clearly. But how can this come out clearly? I think that as many indices, indices, all indices have an issue, all right? They're important. But all indices, not just this index, all indices are reductionist in nature, meaning that putting everything into a figure makes us lose a lot of information. All right. So when we say 20%, 53%, yeah, yes. But what does it really mean? Because the indices tend to be reductionist. I was thinking that if we have resources, meaning that we can add, as you do as you look at your databases and check all this legislation, it may be important to carry out, if possible, some primarily qualitative data in some of these countries, particularly the countries where you are seeing, they're doing very well, the Russian Federation, I don't know, Singapore, other countries that you mentioned. Maybe an additional qualitative data collection to just discuss with key informants in that country, what is it going on? What are the perception of people in this? Then you can add that to help you justify or at least explain transparently the index. So in other words, I'm saying, why don't we go mixed methods? All right. So that then we listen to the people, we listen to the stories of these people, all right? Because each country is unique. Now, you can't do for all the countries, but certainly for some few countries that are really exhibiting either extreme results upwards or extreme results downwards, you may want to do that. So I think that is important, and I want to thank you again for inviting me to be part of this. I have really enjoyed it, and I am with you for a great long time to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ken. And thank you to our lovely panel for all of your amazing feedback. It's much appreciated that you go through the whole document and also give us a lot of things to work on still for the future. I realize we're over time, but I do want to give the final word to a very important person, part of the WageIndicator network, but also part and a mentor to Iftikhar for all of these years, which is Professor Beryl ter Haar, who we've asked to give her final closing remarks on the Labor Rights Index today. I don't know how much introduction she needs in this group of people, but Professor Beryl ter Haar is a professor and head of the Center for International and European Labor Law Studies at the University of Warsaw, and also an endowed professor of European and Comparative Labor Law at the University of Groningen. Her research deals with international and European labor law, especially on collective bargaining, social dialogue, new governance, transnational private regulation, corporate sustainability and human rights due diligence, and the future of social law. She's a co-author, but also editor of many books on international labor law. And we're grateful to have Beryl with us today for her closing remarks. Beryl, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thanks also for this introduction. I will keep it short because we're already over time. So first of all, of course, I want to join all the others with some words of praise. Because just having the idea of doing this kind of an index is one thing. Then to overcome a lot of like substantive challenges like that have been stressed with a lot of the comments we have heard is another thing. But then also to actually make it happen, I think that requires persistence, patience, discipline, a really strong belief in the project and the meaning of it as a whole. And I know for sure that without all these qualities of Iftikhar, this index would never have been realized, developed, and even extended. So Iftikhar, really thank you for all your efforts, time, patience, etc., for making this index happening and continuing also. We've heard already a lot of comments, so I will not do that. I want to stress just a few things on the added value of the Labor Rights Index. And I will not repeat what others have said. And I think it's good that in general, some of the limitations are also acknowledged. We have to be aware of that because it's important it's important to keep that in mind when you're working with the outcome of the index. But at the same time, I want to stress one important thing when we are talking about positive law. like I deal a lot with soft law, and sometimes people get the impression of me that I don't like hard law or positive law at all. That's not the case. I think it's super important to have it. And I think that's what this index also shows, like having the law to start with, it's a start. It's a start for a lot of change. And whenever I talk with people, I always get this, especially when thinking about the future of law. A lot of people keep telling me like law is responsive, so we only develop it when we see a problem and then we think we need to do it differently. So let's draft the law and then it will be arranged and that's it. And I think that's a big misunderstanding. Law is, yes, it is responsive, and yes, we use it to tackle problems, but it's just a start. That's not when we are not there yet. Then we need a lot of other things. We need debates, we need policies, we need people involved, engaged, and talks, and etc. So it's a start of something. But without having those laws, we often cannot even start. So I think a big strength of this index is showing us where are the countries more or less when it comes to having these laws on very important topics that are related like to the ILO decent work, but also to the global development goals. I agree fully also with Elena and Grace that it has a huge importance also in the context of CSR and human rights due diligence and corporate sustainable due diligence. I use it also in my teaching, so I see it with the students. So I think let's keep in mind that without having a view of what kind of laws are out there to start with, it will be super difficult to even make the next steps that we are also much concerned with as well. And I think that's the strength of this index. It gives us the start for having these kind of discussions. So again, Iftikhar and your team and also the WageIndicator for supporting Iftikhar. Thanks for having developed it. To the start, we've already seen, as Elena also stressed, that you have taken into account some of the comments that were given before. So I have great hope for that a lot of comments we've heard today that will be incorporated in the next versions of the database, so the index. So I'm just looking forward to the next developments, and yeah, keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beryl, for your words of encouragement. I think Iftikhar and I can be sure that there will definitely be a 2026 Labor Rights Index launch, and there will also be incorporation of all of your feedback, and we will definitely work with all of you to get to a next session or to a next publication. But first, we're really happy to have the 2024 report out there. That rests me to say, I apologize for going a bit over time. I realize 1.5 hours plus is a bit long, and thank you all for all your time. Like I said in the beginning, we will be sharing the recording as well as all the presentations that were there today. Please check out the website. Shantanu, could you share the last 2 slides or the last slide with where you can also access? And I would very much like to thank Professor Sean Cooney, Professor Beryl de Haar, Ken, Grace, Anne, and Elena, and of course Iftikhar and the whole team for all of their amazing hard work and your feedback during the panel and your input. We hope you just dive into the data, enjoy the index, and like we mentioned, please feel free to reach out to Iftikhar or myself or to the broader team at WageIndicator and the Center for Labor Research if you'd like to know more about the methodology behind it. If you have any questions, if you want access to some pieces of the data, please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to share for all researchers and anybody that wants to use it. So feel welcome, feel included in, as I mentioned, it's a collective process. And if you have any additional sources, of course, indeed, please share them with us. And I want to thank you all for being part of this session today. Happy World Day of Decent Work. I hope it's a good one. And see you at another event next time. Oh, one important thing. I do have to mention. This launch of the Labor Rights Index was an online session, but we will also be having a physical discussion and broader open discussion about the Labor Rights Index and its use and different sources with scholars from across the world and a lot of students as well at the Central European University in Vienna on the 5th of November. We can share with the recording and everything more details about that project or about that session in an email with all of you. Feel welcome to join. It's an open invitation for everybody to join that session as well on the 5th of November in Vienna. And we can discuss much more about everything as well. So it's an ongoing discussion. Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely day. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.